Greetings and welcome to Chapter 10. Now, as I mentioned in the introductory video, I can only record for 15 minutes at a shot with this particular program, which quite frankly is fine because after 15 minutes of listening to me, you could probably use with a break. So we'll see how far we get. I will number these in order so that you know where we are. And with that, let's get going. Personality disorders. The personality disorders are kind of a grab bag of things, not so much as schizophrenia, which we'll be covering later, but still it covers a wide variety of things. Now, what they tend to have in common is fairly general. First of all, they tend to be comprised of inflexible and maladaptive traits. These people don't change, even though their traits don't necessarily do them a whole lot of good. So they don't change, even though the way they behave tends to not help them very much. They tend to have problems dealing with other people. That's another essentially universal factor for the personality disorders. Now, how they have problems, of course, differ from disorder to disorder, but they all definitely have problems dealing with others. There may also be problems with their own identity or their own sense of self. Some more than others. Some are very, very much, boy, this microphone has a tendency to blot when I hit plosives. I may be changing it. At any rate, definitely problems with their own identity. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to be going through this at a pretty good clip because due to the wonders of modern technology, at any time you can pause it, you can rewind it, you can watch it again, you can make sure you have everything written down. So I'm not going to be doing the usual pausing in order to allow you to write stuff down. You're just going to have to kind of watch this with one finger on the pause button. Inability to function adequately in society, that's more or less what the maladaptive covers, because maladaptive means that it's not adaptive, it's not useful, it's not functional. Now, these particular traits need to be pervasive, which means that they need to basically cover a large quantity of things. It's not just one thing or another thing that does it. It has to be a lot of things. They also have to be stable, which means that they don't go away. They stick around, and they stick around for the duration. They stay the same, they stick around, they're inflexible, they don't change. It's saying the same thing a couple of different ways. And in order to be a disorder, like pretty much everything else that we've talked about, it has to either cause clinically significant distress or some kind of impairment. Again, it's the maladaptive part. These aren't necessarily things that just come up one day. It's not like bipolar where you just go bing, bang, boom and, switch back and forth. With these, they gradually develop. So it may start out as a person may just seem a trifle odd or a trifle stubborn or a trifle whatever, but then after a while, things really start to hit. And they really start to, people come to the assumption that this is something that is happening, it's not going away, and it's sticking around. Before this terrifies you too much, remember, just like every disorder, it's possible to have a small amount of one of these disorders and have it not be that big of a deal. It's only when you have a huge amount and it's affecting your life, it's making you unhappy, it's affecting your ability to make a living, affecting your ability to hold a job, to have friends, all of those things. It's only really then that it becomes a problem. So in terms of people who have this disorder to the point that it becomes a real problem, I suspect that number's probably in the 1 to 3% range, depending on the individual and what the situation is that they find themselves in. Now, the personality disorders, I generally skip the personality disorders when I cover general psychology. I mention antisocial personality disorder and, well, these days I mention narcissistic personality disorder and maybe one or two others, but generally we don't go over them in great detail in part because there's a lot of issues with these things. The fact that they are so quote unquote common, um, and it's fairly easy to be diagnosed with one of these. Um, to the point that, like I said, it's possible that all of us show some signs of at least one of these disorders, but it's only if it becomes bad enough to really affect a person's life that it becomes a real problem. And the major difficulties begin with the diagnosis of the thing, because Misdiagnosis of personality disorders is incredibly widespread. People get diagnosed with personality disorders. I mean, on the internet, you get diagnosed with a personality disorder in any way. If you watch any TV shows, there's always people diagnosing an individual with a personality disorder because it's so easy in some ways. And part of the reason it's so easy to misdiagnose is that the criteria for diagnosis is rather vague compared to a lot of other disorders. A lot of other disorders, it's very, very concrete. It's very, you have to have this for this long, it has to look like this, and there you are. But unfortunately, with personality disorders, things are a whole lot more squishy, shall we say, in that the criteria is not necessarily something that, it's vague. It could be anything. So mixed diagnosis is really common. Very often when we're diagnosing these disorders, these personality disorders, um, clinicians actually fall back on an actual theory of personality. And that theory is called the five-factor model. Um, if you're not familiar with this, I don't think I actually have that in one of my general psych videos on this channel. You can look. I don't know if I have any personality, but you may want to look and just take a quick reminder of what it is. Um, Essentially, it uses these five criteria: extroversion, um, openness to experience, how outgoing you are, how creative you are; agreeableness, essentially how nice you are; conscientiousness, essentially how responsible you are; and neuroticism, which is essentially how emotionally volatile you are. And they use these to perhaps be able to diagnose the different personality disorders. Now, each of these factors has several facets. Some of these are good, some of these are bad. Um, some of these you want to have, some of these you don't. As a general rule, you want to score high on all of these with the actual exception of neuroticism. That one you want to kind of score low on. And you can indeed score at any level. It's along a criteria ranging from low to high. It's not an all or nothing. Almost none of these are an all or nothing. So you score along the criteria, and that basically allows then to get an idea of what the person's personality is like. Now, the dimensional approach when they're talking about this is when we look at the extremes. When I say you want to score high on these, you want to score high but not too high. Because if you score too high, it gets to be out of control. It's like being manic is a wonderful thing if you just have a little tiny bit of it. If you have a lot of it, then it really can begin to affect your life negatively. Well, the same is true for even the ones you want to score high on here. If you have too much of it, it can definitely affect your life negatively. And you don't really want to go there. So you could wind up with negative emotions, you could wind up with detachment, you could wind up with antagonism toward others, you could wind up with disinhibition, which basically means that that little voice in your head telling you not to do things takes a break, and so you start doing things you probably shouldn't be doing. And so, yeah, I mean, you get this sort of extremes. Psychoticism is kind of an exception to that. Psychoticism is not an extreme of openness. It's its own special little thing. And we'll talk more about psychoticism when we get further on into the schizophrenia or the schizoaffective and all the rest of those in terms of personality disorders, to talk a little bit more about this. Of course, there are more difficulties, and one of the other real big difficulty here is trying to actually study cases of personality disorder. Part of the reason of this is because it's so overly diagnosed, it's so vague that it can be difficult. You can't really, for instance, state that someone as a child is, at risk for a personality disorder. We don't really have that. We can diagnose children with certain disorders, but not necessarily personality disorders. And so we can't necessarily do a longitudinal and prospective studies and follow children to see what happens. So we don't know an awful lot about the causal factors for these. And they're probably all different. I mean, this again is almost like schizophrenia, which I'll talk about later. It's kind of a grab bag. We have a whole bunch of disorders that we lump together as personality disorders, in some cases because we don't have a better place to put them. Personality disorders per se only entered the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, in 1980. Which, considering that the first version of the DSM came out a decade or two or three before, it's relatively recent. That may seem it was a long time ago, but not in terms of psychology. There's also a lot of overlap with comorbidity. Very often when people have one personality disorder, they may also have another, or they may have other disorders. They may have a mood disorder. They may have an anxiety disorder. They may have some disorders we haven't talked about yet. So there's a lot of overlap here. A lot of overlap. And as I mentioned, we can't really follow people the before the disorder develops because we can't necessarily point out people who are at risk at personality disorders before they have them. And we can't always just go back and go with memory because memories can be changed. So what causes it? Is it temperament? Is it learning? Is it your parents in the grand Freudian tradition of blaming your parents for everything that goes wrong with you? Is it physical abuse or sexual abuse? They don't know. They're working on it. So now that I have set the scene for these disorders, what I'm going to do next is actually take a bit of a leap right into the disorders themselves. And I'm going to do that in a separate video simply because we only got 3.5 minutes left on this one, and I may well wind up making a different video for each of the disorders. I don't know. We'll see. At any rate, go ahead and go on to the next one when you're ready.